Hey guys, it's Chris, and I'm back with another Game of Thrones video. Well, not really a Game of Thrones video, more like a Game of Thrones prequel video. Of course, we got the news yesterday. We're getting the new prequel House of the Dragon based off the Targaryen history, all the way back from Aegon the Conqueror, all the way up to Aerys II, the Mad King, Dany's father. So let's jump right in and talk about what we could and likely will see in House of the Dragon. Alright, so let's jump right into the House of the Dragon preview. These are things that we will likely see in this new Game of Thrones prequel. I will say really quickly, I understand a lot of people are not interested in any prequel because of how Game of Thrones ended. But at the same time, there are great stories that happened in Westeros long before, the ending of Game of Thrones. It's almost like Star Wars. A lot of people didn't like The Last Jedi, but there's so many other great stories in the universe. So it's something I think will be pretty damn good, and George R. R. Martin will be a showrunner. And of course, Dan and Dave are not involved whatsoever at HBO anymore. They're over now at Netflix to screw up stuff over there. So anyway, this will be ran by George R. R. Martin, and we actually have source material as far as Fire and Blood, the latest book from him, and part 2 will be coming out after The Winds of Winter, supposedly. But he already has all this mapped out, so there's no real issue with somebody having to make up a bunch of shit and screwing it up. So anyway, the first thing we're likely to see is Aegon's conquest. Of course, this is Aegon the Conqueror we speak of, the ancestor of Daenerys and Jon, of course, and Aegon and his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys Targaryen, with their dragons, Balerion the Black Dread, which we've heard so much about, and Vhagar and Meraxes when they conquered the Seven Kingdoms, except for Dorne. And of course, this is during the time period 300 years before Game of Thrones, where the Seven Kingdoms were actually the Seven Kingdoms. There were 7 different rulers, where they were all actually different kings or queens in their own regions. Would be the Starks, of course, in the north. Torrhen Stark was the last king in the north, who was referenced in the main show for being the king who knelt when Dany and Jon met at Dragonstone in Season 7. We had House Arryn, the rulers of the Vale, specifically Ronald Arryn, who was the king of the Vale. We had House Hoare, who were the king of the Isles that would later on become the Iron Islands. We had House Lannister, of course, the king of the Rock. We know House Lannister to this day. We had House Gardner, who were the kings of the Reach, and Highgarden, who would eventually be replaced by House Tyrell, of course we know in the modern story. We also had House Durrandon, who were originally the Storm Kings, and this is where, of course, House Baratheon took over their sigil and their titles and all that at Storm's End. And then, of course, we had House Martell, who was also the rulers in Dorne at that time. And Dorne, by the way, was the only kingdom never officially conquered by Aegon and his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys. We'll have many notable battles. One would be the burning of Harrenhal. This is when King Harren the Black, where he was actually roasted in his own castle, Harrenhal, which we have seen in Game of Thrones. You saw when Arya met with Tywin and was his cupbearer and all that stuff at Harrenhal. They told the story there of how the dragons melted that castle. We have other battles such as the Field of Fire. Now, this was referenced in Season 7 as well, when a lot of us, at least on YouTube, were calling the Dany attack on the loot train the Field of Fire 2.0, and this is where House Gardner was actually wiped out, and House Lannister yielded to Aegon, and Highgarden was then granted to Harlan Tyrell, who had been stewards to the Gardners. So this is where House Tyrell comes in, as I mentioned before. Of course, we will see some stuff with the Starks as well. We will see again Torrhen Stark, who is known as the King Who Knelt. This again was referenced in Season 7 when Dany and Jon met on Dragonstone. Torrhen Stark yielded to Aegon after hearing about the Field of Fire and became the first Warden of the North. And all these famous battles and many, many more, of course, took place during the same time that Aegon started collecting all the swords of his fallen enemies and sending them back to what was called the Aegon Fort. Now, the Aegon Fort was originally known as Aegon's Landing. This is where Aegon and his sisters left Dragonstone and actually set foot for the first time in Westeros itself and landed near the Blackwater Rush and built what was called the Aegon Fort that would eventually become King's Landing. So it's going to be cool to see some of these locations and events happen that would become the things we know in Game of Thrones as far as what we see today in quote-unquote the modern era of A Song of Ice and Fire. And during this prequel spin-off series, we will also see many of the customs and organizations that were formed that we are now familiar with and where they all started. For example, the Kingsguard. Aegon the Conqueror had many assassination attempts, and one of his sister wives said, you know what, I'm going to choose the best warriors in the Seven Kingdoms to protect you at all times because you're letting your guard down, and so we'll see the White Cloaks being formed. And keep in mind, by the way, that Aegon's conquest took 2 years alone. A lot of people think that, he just came over, he had dragons, and everybody just bent the knee instantly. No, the conquest of Westeros took about 2 years, where he finally united the entire 7 kingdoms. So I don't know exactly how they're going to do this prequel, but I could imagine they could actually do 1 season per Targaryen king, and that would be a pretty cool way to do it. So in other words, the entire season 1, maybe it's Aegon's conquest, and then season 2 they'll pick up with his son Aenys, who became king after him. And keep in mind that Fire and Blood Volume 1 does cover the lineage of Targaryen kings all the way back from Aegon the Conqueror all the way up till Aegon III's reign. And then of course Volume 2 will cover the rest of the Targaryen kings all the way up through Aerys the Mad King, Dany's father. So at least so far in Fire and Blood Volume 1, we have Aegon the Conqueror, then we had Aenys, his son, we had Maegor the Cruel. You've probably heard that name in Game of Thrones. Maegor's holdfast is named after him. We had Jaehaerys, which a lot of people thought that Jon Snow's real name was going to be, known as the Conciliator or the Old King. And because of similarities in him and Jon Snow, a lot of people thought that he would be named Jaehaerys, and that still may be a thing in the book, but more than likely his name is going to be Aegon there as well. Then we had Viserys I, and then Aegon II, whose reign was disputed by his half-sister Rhaenyra, which began what's called the Dance of the Dragons, where most of the Targaryen dragons died out, as well as both Aegon and Rhaenyra, which they were referred to as the Blacks and the Greens. So you've probably heard a lot of people on YouTube talking about this Dance of the Dragons, and that's what we thought we were going to get in Season 8, kind of the Dance of the Dragons 2.0, when Viserion was turned to an ice dragon and then battled Jon and Dany mid-air and all that kind of stuff, although we got a little bit of that, not nearly as much as we wanted, and we, of course, couldn't see anything in the damn dark in Episode 3. And then finally, at least for Fire and Blood Volume 1, we have Aegon III, known as the Dragonbane, and this is the time when the last of the Targaryen dragons died, and we would not see any more dragons in the world until Daenerys Targaryen hatched 3 dragon eggs over in Essos. So we should see a lot of these big major events we've all heard about that's been referenced in the main show, but we'll also see cool things like Alyssa Farman, who left Westeros to sail around the world, much like Arya Stark, what's west of Westeros, where she stole the actual dragon eggs that would eventually hatch into Rhaegal, Viserion, and Drogon. We'll see how that actually happened. We can see stuff like the Targaryen house ancestral swords, Blackfyre and Dark Sister, and potentially where they ended up. Now, I had speculated back in an earlier season of Game of Thrones that Dark Sister should be with Bloodraven in his cave, north of the wall somewhere, but they decided just to leave that out, although they had a perfect opportunity to at least showcase that sword when Mira picked up that random sword leaning against the wall. At some point, we could see something about the great bastards of Aegon IV Targaryen, one who happened to be named Brynden Rivers, who would eventually become the magical tree wizard that we call Bloodraven, that I just mentioned as well. We could see Jaehaerys I, the Old King Targaryen, traveling Westeros and holding court in places other than King's Landing. He liked to be seen by the people. This is why people loved him. He was one of these great Targaryen kings. So he would travel around Westeros all over the place and hold court there for months at a time, and not just sit there in King's Landing the entire time. And we would see him with his wife, called Good Queen Alysanne, who flew Silverwing to the Wall visiting the Night's Watch, and her dragon Silverwing, by the way, refused to fly north of the Wall, and now we know why. We will certainly see a lot of battles and stuff like that, but we'll also see some political stuff in the sense of the clash of the faith of the Seven with the Targaryens for their incestuous marriages. So this is something that the Targaryens, even though they were conquering everything and did unify Westeros under one rule, the faith of the Seven thought it was an abomination that they were marrying their sisters and inbreeding and all that stuff. So there were a lot of political tensions there, and a lot of things took place during that time period as well. We can see the real Jenny of Oldstones that was referenced in Game of Thrones a couple of times, actually, especially during that scene where Sam is trying to talk to the Maester, saying the White Walkers are a real thing. And of course, that goes along with the mystery of the tragedy at Summerhall, the night Rhaegar Targaryen was born, where apparently Aegon V was potentially trying to hatch dragon eggs again to bring dragons back into the world. And of course, we could see the Blackfyre rebellions, which led to House Blackfyre, and eventually Bloodraven or Brynden Rivers being sent to the Wall, where he would end up going north of the Wall, getting lost apparently, and becoming the Three-Eyed Raven. And that also led to the formation of the Golden Company over in Essos, which of course in Game of Thrones Season 8, they were depicted as doing nothing whatsoever. And on top of that, they didn't even get time to die well. So those are just a few things among so much more that we could see during this Game of Thrones prequel. And this is just an overview here, so feel free to add more events that we may see in the comments below. But keep in mind, this is a fictional history told through the eyes of Archmaester Gyldain, and Gyldain also cites the accounts written by a dwarf named Mushroom in this book, who was the court fool of Viserys I Targaryen up through Aegon III, and people thought that he was just a plain idiot, so they spoke freely around him. So Mushroom ended up writing a book of his own called The Testimony of Mushroom. That was a little bit more colorful than Gyldain's account. So Gyldain in this book, Fire and Blood, often references Mushroom's testimony, where Gyldain's is a little more straightforward. Mushroom talks about lies and murder and treason and all these different plots and everything. So the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, and regardless of how Game of Thrones Season 8 ended, it should be fun to find out how things actually happened during this whole entire time period, up until the start of Game of Thrones, where Aerys II, the Mad King, was the last Targaryen king. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think in the comments below. And as usual, thank you for all the support, especially you guys on Patreon. And a huge shout out to my executive Patreon SmokeScreen producers. And if you dig what I do here, please give these videos a like, comment, and a share. And we have a lot more to do on this channel as well. We will be covering The Witcher starting in December. We certainly will be covering Star Wars The Mandalorian, which starts here in a couple weeks. And filming news and all that stuff we will definitely throw out there as well as they start to move this process forward. I think this will go pretty damn fast. So with all that said, be sure to subscribe to get everything and click that notification bell so you're notified when I drop a new video. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.